Cape Cod Broadcasting weaves the listening environments of 99.9 WQRC, Ocean 104.7, WFCC Classical 107.5, Cape Country 104, and CapeCon.com's website experience to reflect the lifestyles of the people who live, work, and play on Cape Cod. We hope that you enjoy this podcast.
Good morning. I'm Laura Reckford, and this is Sunday Journal. I'm here in the studio with Dick LeGrand and Duncan Oliver of the Historical Society of Old Yarmouth, and we're talking about how the town of Yarmouth played a role during the War of 1812. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
So even though we're talking about the War of 1812, some of the big events happened in 1814, and that's why we're celebrating the 200th anniversary of those events this year. Is that right?
That's correct. In 1812, the United States had declared war on Great Britain. For Great Britain, the war was really, at that point, about fighting Napoleon, and they were focused entirely on Europe. Napoleon abdicated in the spring of 1814, and that freed the British to turn their attention on the upstart Americans. That's when they sent their fleet big time toward the Cape and when there were a lot more incidents here.
And what was really affecting Cape Cod as a maritime center was an embargo on shipping. Is that right?
That's correct. The Americans themselves had embargoed shipping to try to keep the British from impressing American seamen. That led to real economic problems for the nation to begin with, but for seafaring areas, and especially areas like Cape Cod, there were a tremendous amount of hardships because of the embargo to begin with. And then when the British arrived with an even greater strength of blockade, there were some real problems on the Cape.
And we should take one little step back and talk about the Historical Society of Old Yarmouth and how the society got involved in really looking into this. Duncan?
Well, our Historical Society isn't simply let's celebrate the good times. It's let's look for new history and let's find out what really happened here in the Cape, Mid-Cape region, well, actually the whole Cape. And so we have a very active archival center and people who are researching all the time. And about 2010, everybody realized the War of 1812 was coming up, and yet there was nothing really written about the War of 1812 in Yarmouth. And it was the Rodney Dangerfield Awards. It didn't get any respect, and we wanted it to have respect. And so with the research, with what Dick found out about Lewis Bay and new things about Bass River and some of the others, we came up with a series of talks that were put on at the Maritime Symposium in 2012. And now that it's the actual 200th anniversary, we're doing a boat tour to show people the actual locations in Lewis Bay of some of these locations.
And then in the course of doing this research, you use some of the archives, I guess, that the Historical Society has, perhaps, and also from local libraries and things like that. Where did you go for your research?
Well, we went to several libraries on the Cape, many of which have a really good set of records. We also used Boston newspapers. We used some of the, especially the older Cape historians who had written in the 1800s and 1900s and were pretty familiar with what had happened.
There aren't any newspapers on the Cape in 1812, so we couldn't go back to the original resources there. But in Boston, there are a number, and they're all online, so you can get them. And so some of our research was done on the Internet to pick up that kind of information.
And so you did quite a bit of research, and I guess there were several towns on the Cape that were, in fact, involved, and perhaps Falmouth the most in terms of the Nimrod bombing. And can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, of all of the towns, Falmouth took the heaviest hits, with more than 300 cannonballs being fired at it at one period of time. They were also probably the most feisty. They had a cannon that the British wanted, and when the British said, we'd like that cannon, the head of the militia in Falmouth said, come and get it, which resulted in a bombardment. The British were kind enough to give them some hours' notice so that the women and children could leave, but Falmouth did suffer some serious damage.
And there were some 300 cannonballs or so?
Right, and there are still some holes and places there. The Nimrod Tavern, which has been moved but does have a cannonball hole still in it in the men's room, but I understand women sneak in to look at the where the hole is. Lots of things.
And some other towns on the Cape, Barnstable and Orleans, they also they suffered a couple of hits, but not nearly as much as Falmouth. Is that right?
Right.
And
Orleans had the final battle, December 19th, where British Marines came ashore because the Orleans people had burned some spars from one of the British vessels that had run aground, and they were paying them back. But places like Brewster had to come up with $4,000 so it wouldn't have its salt works burned. Eastham had to come up with another $1,200 because of alleged things that they had done to the British. And Yarmouth got hit with a $1,000 fine, and that's the thing that I worked on Bass River.
And so Bass River was really a central area where the British were very interested in this. Tell me about that.
Well, Bass River was a little fishing village, the mouth of Bass River. And in early July, it was the first time that the British had said, if you give us money, we won't destroy your things. And what supposedly happened was that a ship came, a little vessel, not a ship, a sloop or something, came sailing in very quickly, and the British saw it come in. Now, it could have been going to Lewis Bay, which is a big trading area. Hard to tell because Bass River mouth and Lewis Bay are only 3 or 4 miles apart. And the British made the Yarmouth people pay $1,000 if they wanted to continue to fish. Well, Yarmouth could only come up with $660. They paid them, and then before they could come up with the rest of the money, the British sailed away because they saw another vessel. What the British didn't know at the time is that the Yarmouth money was, in fact, worthless. It came from Farmers Bank, which had no value. And this is a new twist that we've discovered in the last year. Didn't know about it when the original writings were there. So it's, why would the British be angry if the money was worthless? Why do they even bother?
So it was a little trick that the town played on them. Is that right?
I don't think it was a trick. I don't think they really knew. There wasn't a national currency then. Individual banks and even stores could do their own commerce, their own currency, and some was very good and some was worthless. That's why you still were going with gold and silver, actual gold and silver. These were paper script.
I'm Laura Reckford, and this is Sunday Journal. We're talking about the War of 1812 and the particularly events that happened in 1814 and how they related to the Cape with members of the Historical Society of Old Yarmouth. Now, one thing that was interesting is that Yarmouth Town Meeting got involved in this. Tell me about that discussion and how that played out.
Yarmouth was not eager to get involved in the War of 1812. They saw it, matter of fact, the title of a book, A Ruinous and Unhappy War, those are words that came from the Yarmouth Town Meeting. They said that we're determined not to engage in or be encouraged to support the war any further than we are compelled to do so by the laws of the country. Barnstable, on the other hand, was a feisty crew. They were quite willing to stand up. Their point was that in a time of danger, it's the duty of every citizen to rally around the standards of his country and resist such invasion and depredations with all the means in their power.
And Nantucket, on the other hand, declared neutrality. They weren't on either side, and here they were Americans, but were saying they were neutral in the war. But they were out far enough that they couldn't get supplies if the British Navy shut them off. So they really had to. And I think Americans understood why Nantucket declared neutrality. And it was a big Quaker center. While there was a lot of whaling there, the Quakers are peace-loving people and oppose war of any sort. And it's a very interesting time.
The politics of this really is very interesting, and maybe we could get into a little more what the politics were in terms of where people stood on this and how towns decided what they were going to do.
Well, Federalists were primarily Northeast people, and a new war hawk party, the Democratic Republicans, more in the South and in the West, Henry Clay and those people. So you really see politics entering into the war. And where the war was the biggest, out in the West, Michigan, or going up to York in Canada to burn the town, or down south in Maryland, those were people that supported the war. Here, it even got so bad that there was going to be a convention, a Hartford Convention, a little bit later to talk about secession. And I find it interesting that Cape Cod and New England talk about secession when later we fought against it 40 years later. But Hartford Convention never came to pass because, in fact, the war was over by the end of the year.
And in this war, I guess at one point the British were off Provincetown Harbor and were doing somewhat of a blockade. Tell me about that. How did that work?
The British used Provincetown as a base. Provincetown was a point from which they could keep an eye on Massachusetts Bay. They were particularly interested in trying to keep the Constitution bottled up in Boston. For a good deal of the time they succeeded in that. Other times she got out and caused them a great deal of trouble. From Provincetown, they were also able to keep a good eye on Nantucket Sound. Nantucket Sound and it's in the outlet, the Lewis Bay and Hyannis Harbor outlet to Nantucket Sound, were a busy place for American ships coming over from Europe up out of the Caribbean, and the British wanted someplace close where they could get fresh water, where they could get fresh vegetables, fresh beef if they could get it out of Provincetown, which they did, and it made a good base for them.
And the other British base was Tarpaulin Cove on Noshawn Island, which is right near Falmouth, which caused Falmouth no end of grief. And this is one reason why Falmouth became so feisty, and they went over and tried to burn British vessels and privateers and things like that. So there really was an engagement with the British more in Falmouth than at Provincetown. The Provincetown people realized they could make money selling to the British because the British always paid well. And so Provincetown really has no anti-British warfare taking place during the time. They were either neutral or pro-British because they could make money on it.
And this area of Lewis Bay, in particular Great Island, and we think that perhaps there was a fort there. Is that right, that this was really quite a center for dealing with this?
Great Island may well have been the location of a fort named Fort Masonic. We're almost positive that name came from the fact that masons, who worked with bricks and were builders, were the constructors of that fort. Great Island was fortified in various ways, as was the Fish Hill area in Barnstable. There were breastworks, by the way, are simply trenches, dug along the Bayview area of Lewis Bay. The British actually came ashore at one point near, we believe, Fish Hills. They had chased an American ship into Lewis Bay. They were shooting at it. The captain of the American ship purposely beached it to find immediate safety, get his crew off. The British ship came closer, and when the British, they decided they wanted to come ashore and try to burn that ship, destroy it. Now, they couldn't get in close with their larger frigate. When the British were near ashore, they would use barges or smaller boats from their larger ships. And in this case, they did, and headed toward the beached American ship. By this time, the militia from Barnstable, and we think in part from Yarmouth as well, were able to rally. We know that they had one cannon with them. We know that they advanced to meet the British, and they drove them back to the ship. That's the one landing we're sure of that happened briefly in Barnstable.
And it's hard for people to maybe get their head around the fact that Fish Hills, which now has these big, beautiful homes overlooking the harbor, that was really a very strategic area back then.
It protected Gage's Wharf. If you go down Bayview street in Yarmouth, right by the hospital. At the end, there's a beach. And there was a wharf there during the War of 1812, Gage's Wharf. And that was the big unloading place for privateers during the war and for things coming into Hyannis Harbor. And Fish Hills was designed to protect Gage's Wharf, as was Great Island.
And Hyannis Harbor, as it is now, still very bustling. Hyannis Harbor was a big deal back then. Is that right?
Hyannis Harbor was. It was a safe port. You know, it's busy now. You can see a lot of structures and a lot of boats in there. It was probably no less busy back in the early 1800s. It didn't look quite as splendid. The boats weren't quite as nice, but it was a busy place, and it was a major place for ships coming both from Europe and from South America, the Caribbean, to land material on the East Coast. Gage's Wharf was a very important unloading point. During the war itself, blockade runners, if they could make the safety of Hyannis Harbor, goods would be unloaded there and then taken overland in many cases up to Boston to keep the goods safe from the British blockade in Massachusetts Bay.
But that's not to say that there weren't things on the north side, too. Barnstable got 4 cannon, 2 of which are still by the courthouse, but they were set up near where the Unitarian Universalist church is, overlooking the harbor. And they were serious enough that the British never decided to come ashore and attack Barnstable Village. So there were preparations on the north side as well.
So many interesting aspects to this, and I want to let people know if they want to find out more. You've put together a booklet, is that right?
We did. To go along with this, the cruise that we're having, we did a booklet that if you come by the Historical Society offices, which are right next to our post office, Tuesdays and Thursdays, you can pick one up for free, just so you know more about it. We've also written articles, and they've been in local papers, and we're just trying to make history known to people so that they will find more interest in our past.
Such an interesting topic. Dick, you had another comment?
Well, we are going to do a cruise of Lewis Bay, pointing out the historic points and talking about some of the incidents that happened. Right now, we've got a pretty full boat, but we do have a waiting list that's available if anybody wants to get on that. The number to call would be 508-362-3021. You probably would get a recording, but you could leave a message saying you'd like to be on the waiting list, leaving your information.
And I'm sure that will be a wonderful trip to find out more about all this history. Unfortunately, now we're out of time. I'm Laura Reckford, and this is Sunday Journal.
This podcast is a presentation of Cape Cod Broadcasting, which is solely responsible for its content. Thank you for listening. For more information, please visit us at capecodbroadcasting.com.